What if I told you that for nearly a decade, American doctors deliberately infected children with a deadly disease? Not prisoners of war, not volunteers, children. Vulnerable children who couldn't speak for themselves, children whose only crime was being born different, children who were abandoned by families who couldn't cope, and then abandoned again by a medical system that saw them as nothing more than lab rats. This happened in New York City in the 1950s and 60s, in a place that was supposed to heal, but instead became a chamber of horrors disguised as science. You are watching Dreaded, and what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about medical ethics, human dignity, and how far society will go when it convinces itself that progress justifies suffering. This is the story of Willowbrook State School and the hepatitis experiments that turned innocent children into unwilling test subjects in one of the most disturbing chapters in American medical history. Before we continue, we'd like to remind you to subscribe now. The year was 1947. America was basking in the glow of victory. The war was over. Technology was advancing. Medicine was making miraculous breakthroughs. Penicillin had saved countless soldiers. The iron lung was helping polio victims breathe. Vaccines were on the horizon. It seemed like science could conquer anything. But with this optimism came something darker. A dangerous belief that had taken root in the medical establishment, that the ends justified the means, that progress was worth any price, especially if that price was paid by those who had no voice to protest. And nowhere was this belief more toxic than in the treatment of society's most vulnerable, the mentally disabled. In 1947, New York State opened what they called a state school on Staten Island, Willowbrook State School. It was supposed to be a place of care and education for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, a beacon of progressive thinking. Instead, it became hell on earth. Designed to house 4,000 residents, Willowbrook quickly swelled to 6,000, then 7,000. The overcrowding was catastrophic. Children were packed into rooms like sardines. The smell of urine and feces hung in the air. Staff members were overwhelmed, underpaid, and often cruel. But the overcrowding wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the disease. Hepatitis, a viral infection that attacks the liver. It spread through Willowbrook like wildfire. Jaundiced yellow skin, chronic fatigue, nausea, vomiting, fever, and in severe cases, death. By some estimates, nearly 90% of children admitted to Willowbrook contracted hepatitis within 6 months of arrival. The institution had become a breeding ground for infection, a pestilence factory where vulnerable children were condemned to suffer. Most people saw this as a tragedy, a problem to be solved. But Dr. Saul Krugman saw it differently. He saw it as an opportunity. And that's where our nightmare truly begins. The unfolding, step by step. Chapter 1, The Scientist and His Twisted Logic. Dr. Saul Krugman wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was respected, published, celebrated. He held positions at New York University and the American Pediatric Society. To the outside world, he was a distinguished physician dedicated to healing children. But Krugman had a theory. He believed that hepatitis wasn't just one disease, but several distinct forms that mimicked each other, what we now know as hepatitis A and hepatitis B. To prove this theory, he needed controlled studies, careful observation, systematic data collection. And Willowbrook, with its guaranteed hepatitis infections, looked like the perfect laboratory. Krugman's reasoning was seductive in its simplicity. If these children are going to get hepatitis anyway, why not infect them deliberately under controlled conditions? We can study the disease progression, we can test potential treatments, we can gather invaluable data that will help millions of children in the future. It was logic wrapped in the language of medicine, rationalization disguised as compassion. What Krugman conveniently ignored was a fundamental truth. These children weren't going to get hepatitis anyway. They were getting hepatitis because Willowbrook was a hellhole of neglect and poor sanitation. The solution wasn't to study the disease, it was to fix the conditions that caused it. But fixing Willowbrook wouldn't advance Krugman's career. It wouldn't get him published in prestigious journals. It wouldn't make him famous in medical circles. So instead, he chose a different path. A path that would turn vulnerable children into human guinea pigs for nearly 2 decades. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Evil. In 1956, Krugman began his experiments. But he didn't start with random children. He was too clever for that. Instead, he created what he called a special unit. Parents, desperate to get their disabled children into Willowbrook, were told that the main facility had a long waiting list, months, maybe years. But there was another option, a special research unit with immediate openings, better conditions, more attention from doctors. All they had to do was sign a consent form allowing their child to participate in hepatitis research. For desperate parents who had been rejected by other institutions, who were struggling to care for disabled children with no support, who were told by society that their children were burdens, it seemed like a miracle. They didn't understand what they were signing. How could they? The consent forms were deliberately vague, filled with medical jargon that obscured the true nature of what was about to happen. And so, one by one, children arrived at Krugman's special unit. Children as young as 3 years old. Children who couldn't understand what was happening to them. Children who trusted the adults in white clothes to help them feel better. Instead, those adults were about to make them terribly, deliberately sick. Chapter 3. Methods of Infection. The Devil in the Details. What Krugman did next defies comprehension. He developed systematic methods for infecting children with hepatitis. Methods that were clinical, precise, monstrous. Some children were given what Krugman called viral cocktails, food deliberately contaminated with hepatitis virus extracted from the stool and blood of already infected patients. Chocolate milk laced with liquid disease, pudding mixed with viral specimens, orange juice that carried death. Can you imagine it? A 3-year-old child, already confused and frightened in the strange place, being offered a special treat. A kind nurse saying, "Here, sweetie, drink this. It will make you feel better." The child trusting, swallowing, sealing their fate. Other children were injected directly. Needles carrying concentrated doses of hepatitis virus plunged into small arms. Doctors marked the injection sites, recorded the dosages, scheduled follow-up observations. Then came the waiting and the watching. Children would develop symptoms within weeks. First came the fever, then the fatigue. Their skin would gradually turn yellow as the virus attacked their livers. They would vomit, refuse to eat, cry from pain they couldn't understand. And through it all, doctors took notes, drew blood samples, collected stool specimens, measured symptom progression with the cold precision of scientists studying lab rats. In one of his published papers, Krugman described the process with chilling clinical detachment. The only effect of the inoculation was an icteric illness with complete recovery in all instances. The only effect. as if deliberately poisoning children was a minor side effect, as if their suffering was merely data to be collected. But those sterile words hide the reality of what happened in those rooms. Children shivering with fever, small bodies racked with nausea, yellow skin stretched tight over fragile frames, confusion and pain that couldn't be explained or understood. And worst of all, doctors standing nearby, clipboard in hand, recording every detail of the agony they had deliberately caused. Chapter 4. The Machine of Exploitation. As word spread about Krugman's research, the experiments expanded. What started as a small study became an industrial operation. More children, more infections, more data. By the 1960s, Krugman was running what amounted to a virus factory. Children were sorted into different groups. Some received hepatitis A, others got hepatitis B. Some were infected with multiple strains to study cross-immunity. The staff developed efficient systems for processing new subjects, intake procedures, medical evaluations, assignment to study groups. It was bureaucracy applied to child abuse. And the children? They had no idea what was happening to them. Many had intellectual disabilities that made it impossible to understand or communicate their suffering. They couldn't complain. They couldn't refuse. They couldn't tell anyone on the outside what was being done to them. For Krugman and his team, the silence was convenient. These children were perfect test subjects precisely because they were voiceless. Their disability, which should have made them objects of special protection, instead made them targets for exploitation. The most heartbreaking part is many of these children actually looked forward to their interactions with the research staff. In an institution where neglect was the norm, any attention felt like kindness, even attention that came with needles and experimental treatments. They trusted. They tried to please. They wanted to be good patients. And that trust was systematically betrayed, day after day, year after year. Chapter 5. The medical community's shameful silence. You might think that Krugman's experiments were conducted in secret, hidden from public view, done without the knowledge of the medical establishment. You would be wrong. Krugman published his results openly. His papers appeared in the most prestigious medical journals, the Journal of Pediatrics, the New England Journal of Medicine, the American Journal of Medicine. He presented his findings at medical conferences across the country. The titles of his papers leave no doubt about what he was doing. Infectious hepatitis, studies on the effect of gamma globulin and on the incidence of in-parent infection. Viral hepatitis, new light on an old disease. The medical community didn't just know about the experiments, they celebrated them. In 1965, Krugman was elected president of the American Pediatric Society. He received awards, honors, speaking engagements at major hospitals and universities. His research was hailed as groundbreaking, revolutionary, a model of systematic scientific inquiry. Medical students were taught about his methods. Residents studied his papers. His name appeared in textbooks as an example of rigorous research methodology. How is this possible? How could an entire profession look at the deliberate infection of disabled children and see not horror, but heroism? The answer lies in the medical culture of the time. Disabled individuals, especially children with intellectual disabilities, were seen as less than fully human. Their suffering was acceptable if it served a greater scientific purpose. Their consent was irrelevant because they were considered incapable of making meaningful decisions. This wasn't the thinking of one rogue doctor. It was the normalized perspective of an entire system that had lost its moral compass. Chapter 6. The voices that tried to speak. Not everyone was silent. As early as 1963, some voices began to question what was happening at Willowbrook. Dr. Joan Giles, a physician who had worked at the institution, went public with concerns about the experiments. She argued that deliberately infecting children was unethical, regardless of the scientific value of the research. Her concerns were dismissed. Other medical professionals questioned her motives, suggested she didn't understand the complexities of the research, implied that her opposition was based on emotion rather than logic. Medical ethicist Paul Ramsey wrote extensively about the Willowbrook experiments, arguing that they violated basic principles of human dignity. He pointed out that the children couldn't meaningfully consent, making any research inherently exploitative. His criticisms were largely ignored by the medical mainstream. Ethics, they suggested, shouldn't interfere with important scientific work. Even some parents began to speak out. They realized that their children weren't receiving better care in the research unit. They were just being used. But their voices carried little weight. They were seen as uneducated, emotional, incapable of understanding the greater good being served. For over a decade, these isolated voices cried out against the experiments, and for over a decade, they were systematically silenced by a medical establishment that had convinced itself that progress justified any price. But eventually, the wall of silence would crack, and when it did, the public's reaction would be swift, devastating, and irreversible. The climax. January 6th, 1972, a date that would forever change Willowbrook and expose the experiments to public scrutiny. Geraldo Rivera was a young television reporter looking for a story that would make his career. He had heard rumors about conditions at Willowbrook, but the facility was closed to outside scrutiny. No unauthorized visitors, no cameras, no interviews. So, Rivera did what any determined journalist would do. He found a way anyway. With a hidden camera crew, Rivera snuck into Willowbrook during a shift change. What they captured over the next several hours would shock the entire nation. The footage was devastating. Children lying naked in their own filth, overcrowded rooms where the smell of human waste was overwhelming, staff members who seemed more like prison guards than caregivers. But it wasn't just the general conditions that horrified viewers. It was the specific images of children who appeared to be deliberately neglected, malnourished, covered in sores, and some showing clear signs of illness that was going untreated. And in the background of this horror show were whispers of something even worse. Rumors about experiments, about children being deliberately infected with diseases, about research that was being conducted on the most vulnerable population imaginable. Rivera's exposé aired on ABC TV and was quickly picked up by national networks. Millions of Americans watched, and their reaction was immediate and furious. Phone calls flooded government offices, letters poured into newspapers, protest groups formed overnight. For the first time, the American public was confronted with visual evidence of what happened when society's most vulnerable were abandoned to institutional care. But the footage also did something else. It provided context for understanding the hepatitis experiments that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. Suddenly, Krugman's published papers weren't seen as scientific achievements. They were evidence of systematic abuse. The medical community's praise for his work wasn't recognition of excellence. It was complicity in exploitation. The public finally understood what ethicists and critics had been saying for years, that the Willowbrook experiments represented a fundamental betrayal of medical ethics and human dignity. Within months of Rivera's exposé, Krugman's world began to collapse. Congressional hearings were announced, federal investigations were launched, medical boards began reviewing the ethics of his research. For the first time in his career, Krugman found himself on the defensive. In interviews and hearings, he attempted to justify his work. He argued that the children would have gotten hepatitis anyway, that his research had led to important medical advances, that the ends justified the means. But his arguments fell on deaf ears. The public had seen the conditions at Willowbrook. They had heard the stories of exploitation. They were no longer willing to accept that scientific progress required the sacrifice of disabled children. Professional organizations that had once celebrated Krugman now distanced themselves from his work. Medical journals that had published his research now questioned their editorial decisions. Universities that had hosted his lectures suddenly found their schedules full. The experiments that had continued for nearly 2 decades were finally shut down, not because the medical establishment developed a conscience, but because public outrage made them impossible to continue. The children's testimony. In the aftermath of the exposé, something unprecedented happened. Some of the children who had been subjects in Krugman's experiments began to speak about their experiences. Michael Willens had been infected with hepatitis when he was 7 years old. Now in his 20s, he could finally articulate what had happened to him. Quote, "They told my parents it was for my own good, that they were going to help me. Instead, they made me sick. They watched me suffer, and they did it on purpose." Patricia Crawford remembered the chocolate milk. "It tasted funny, different, but they told me to drink it all, said it would make me strong. I trusted them, I drank it, and then I got so sick I thought I was going to die." These testimonies were devastating. They put human faces on what had previously been abstract ethical debates. They showed that behind the clinical language and scientific justifications were real children who had suffered real harm. And they revealed something that Krugman had always denied, that the children, even those with intellectual disabilities, understood more than anyone had given them credit for. They knew they had been betrayed, they remembered the pain, and they carried the psychological scars of that betrayal for the rest of their lives. Aftermath and consequences. The public outrage triggered by Rivera's exposé led to immediate legal action. In 1975, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of all Willowbrook residents, alleging systematic abuse and violation of constitutional rights. The case, known as New York State Association for Retarded Children versus Carey, resulted in a landmark consent decree. The New York State was ordered to reduce the population at Willowbrook, improve living conditions, and provide adequate medical care. But, notably, the consent decree didn't address the hepatitis experiment specifically. Krugman and his research team were never criminally prosecuted. No financial compensation was provided to the children who had been used as test subjects. The legal system seemed more concerned with fixing the institutional problems than with punishing those who had caused them. The end of Willowbrook. The consent decree marked the beginning of the end for Willowbrook as an institution. Over the next decade, residents were gradually moved to smaller community-based facilities. The massive warehouses for disabled children were slowly emptied. In 1987, Willowbrook State School officially closed its doors. The buildings that had housed so much suffering were abandoned. Nature began to reclaim the grounds where children had been deliberately infected with disease. Today, the site hosts the College of Staten Island. Students walk through hallways where children once lie sick with hepatitis. They attend classes in buildings where medical experiments were conducted on vulnerable subjects. There are no monuments to the children who suffered, no memorials to mark what happened. The history of Willowbrook has literally been built over and forgotten.
Krugman's legacy. What happened to Dr. Saul Krugman?
Despite the controversy surrounding his research, he continued to work in medicine until his retirement. He never faced criminal charges. He never publicly apologized for his role in the experiments. In interviews later in his career, Krugman maintained that his research was ethical and scientifically valuable. He argued that critics didn't understand the complexity of the situation at Willowbrook. He insisted that he had acted in the best interests of the children. When Krugman died in 1995, his obituaries focused on his scientific contributions rather than the ethical controversies surrounding his work. Medical journals praised his research on hepatitis vaccines. Professional organizations remembered him as a pioneer in pediatric medicine. The children he had used as test subjects were barely mentioned. The forgotten victims. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Willowbrook story is how thoroughly the victims have been forgotten. While the experiments are remembered as an important milestone in medical ethics, the individuals who suffered are largely anonymous. Some of the children who were infected with hepatitis developed chronic liver disease. Others suffered long-term psychological trauma from their experience of institutional abuse. A few died from complications related to their infections. But there's no comprehensive record of what happened to them. No follow-up studies tracked their health outcomes. No support services were provided to help them cope with their experiences. They were used as test subjects when it served the interests of medical research, and they were abandoned when the experiments ended and public attention moved on to other issues. Their suffering contributed to important advances in medical ethics, but they received no benefit from those advances. They paid the price for society's moral education without ever being compensated for their sacrifice. Philosophical reflection. The darkness we're capable of. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and society's capacity for evil. How do we explain what happened? How do we understand how respected doctors working at prestigious institutions could deliberately infect children with disease and feel justified in doing so? The easy answer is to dismiss Krugman and his colleagues as monsters, aberrations, products of a less enlightened time when medical ethics were poorly developed. But that explanation lets us off too easily. It allows us to believe that we would never allow such things to happen today, that we've evolved beyond the capacity for such cruelty. The reality is more disturbing. The Willowbrook experiments weren't the product of individual evil, but of systematic dehumanization. They happened because society had created a category of human beings who were considered less deserving of basic rights and protections. Disabled children were seen as burdens, defective, less than fully human. Their suffering was acceptable because they weren't considered to have the same moral status as normal children. This dehumanization wasn't accidental. It was reinforced by law, by policy, by professional practice, and by cultural attitudes. Families were encouraged to institutionalize disabled children and forget about them. Medical professionals were trained to see disability as pathology rather than difference. Once children were stripped of their full humanity, using them as test subjects became not just acceptable, but logical. If they weren't fully human, their consent didn't matter. If they were going to suffer anyway, why not make their suffering serve a useful purpose? This is the same logic that has justified atrocities throughout history, the logic that allowed slavery, that enabled the Holocaust, that permits exploitation of vulnerable populations around the world today. The complicity of silence. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments reveal the power of institutional silence. Krugman didn't conduct his research in secret. He published openly, presented his findings publicly, and was celebrated by his peers. The medical community knew what was happening. They chose to look the other way because it served their interests. The research was generating valuable knowledge. It was advancing careers. It was bringing prestige to institutions. Individual doctors who might have had qualms about the ethics stayed silent because speaking out would have damaged their careers. Professional organizations that might have questioned the research stayed silent because it would have meant admitting their own complicity. This silence wasn't passive. It was active complicity. Every medical professional who read Krugman's papers without objecting became part of the system that enabled child abuse in the name of science. It's tempting to believe that the Willowbrook experiments represent a historical aberration, that we've learned from these mistakes and would never allow such things to happen today. But are we so different? We still test medical treatments primarily on poor populations in developing countries, while the benefits flow mainly to rich patients in developed countries. We still conduct research on prisoners, refugees, and other vulnerable groups who have limited ability to refuse participation. We still maintain vast disparities in healthcare access based on race, class, and nationality. We still treat some human beings as more deserving of protection than others. The specific methods may have changed, but the underlying logic of exploitation remains. We still believe that progress justifies sacrifice, especially when that sacrifice is borne by those who have no power to resist. The question of forgiveness. What do we owe the victims of Willowbrook? Is it possible to forgive what was done to them? Should we even try? Some might argue that the medical advances that resulted from Krugman's research have saved more lives than were harmed by the experiments, that the development of hepatitis vaccines have prevented countless deaths and prevented immeasurable suffering. But this utilitarian calculation misses something fundamental. The children of Willowbrook weren't volunteers in a noble cause. They were victims of exploitation. Their suffering wasn't freely given. It was stolen from them. And you cannot retroactively justify abuse by pointing to positive outcomes that the victims never consented to produce. The children of Willowbrook didn't sacrifice themselves for medical progress. They were sacrificed by others who decided their lives were expendable. And even if we accept that some good came from their suffering, what does that say about us as a society? Are we comfortable living with medical advances built on the bodies of exploited children? Can we enjoy the benefits of vaccines knowing they were developed through the deliberate infection of vulnerable subjects? These are not easy questions. They don't have comfortable answers, but they are questions we must ask if we want to understand the true cost of the progress we celebrate. The story of Willowbrook is not just about medicine. It's about power. It's about how societies decide which lives matter and which lives are expendable. It's about the human capacity to rationalize cruelty when it serves our interests. The children of Willowbrook couldn't fight back. They couldn't protest. They couldn't tell their stories until decades later, when most of the damage was already done. They were chosen as victims not because of anything they had done, but because of what they were: vulnerable, voiceless, and forgotten.
Their suffering gave us vaccines that have saved millions of lives. Their exploitation gave us ethical guidelines that protect research subjects today. Their silence gave us a voice in debates about medical morality. But they paid a price they never agreed to pay. They sacrificed things they never chose to sacrifice. And most of them died without ever receiving acknowledgement, compensation, or even an apology for what was done to them. The last survivor of the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments is probably still alive today. Somewhere, there's an elderly person carrying the physical and psychological scars of what happened to them as a child. They remember the taste of poisoned chocolate milk. They remember the fever and the yellow skin. They remember being watched and studied while they suffered. What do we owe that person? What do we owe their memory? And here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If you had been a parent in 1956, desperate to get care for your disabled child, would you have signed that consent form? If you had been a doctor in 1960, would you have spoken out against the experiments? If you had been a member of the public before 1972, would you have cared enough to ask what was happening behind the walls of Willowbrook? The comfortable answer is yes. We would have been different. We would have been better. We would have protected the innocent. But the children of Willowbrook were surrounded by people who thought they were good, moral, caring individuals. Parents who loved their children. Doctors who took oaths to do no harm. Citizens who believed in justice and human dignity. And yet the experiments continued for 2 decades. So tell us in the comments, do you believe the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments were a necessary step in medical progress or an unforgivable crime against humanity? And how do we ensure that our quest for scientific advancement never again comes at the cost of exploiting our most vulnerable? If this story has disturbed you, as it should, make sure you subscribe to Dreaded, because these are the stories that reveal who we really are when no one is watching. These are the truths that history would rather forget, but that we must remember. The children of Willowbrook deserve at least that much. They deserve to be remembered not as research subjects or case studies, but as human beings who suffered so we could learn the difference between progress and exploitation. Their voices were silenced in life. Don't let them be silenced in death.